All right, we're in Genesis chapter 24. The first question is, where did Abraham say the wife God would choose for Isaac would be? This is in verse 4. Abraham, speaking to his servant, says, "But will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac." The second question, how do you think he knew this? How did he know that the wife that God was going to choose for his son would not be among the Canaanites and would be in his own country, his home country, and particularly even in his own country, he specifically said that she would be among his own relatives and in his father's household? And the answer to this, we can't be entirely certain. The Bible does not mention that he had any revelation from heaven or revelation from God directly telling him this, though that still could have been the case, though it wasn't mentioned. But probably, I think it's reasonable to conclude that he didn't have a direct revelation from God, but based on his own understanding of God's principles, looking around at the women of Canaan, and also knowing the women in his own country outside of his family, he believed that as far as he could tell, the type of woman that Isaac would need for a wife would be among his father's household in the land of, and not in the land of Canaan. And I think this helps us as we're really jumping to the last question. We'll be looking at the answer to the ninth question throughout the video. How does this help us in discerning God's will for us? I think it's helpful to understand from this that God's will for us, often we can narrow it down without divine revelation, without explicit messages from God, without signs, as we see used here as well. We can narrow it down based on God's general revelation, based on the word of God, based on the principles of God. God's will is going to be within the limits of his revealed will, within the limits of his principles. And so obviously, if we have to cheat or steal to get something, if we have to exercise selfishness to get something, then that thing is not in harmony with God's will for us. It seems like an easy example, but sometimes these things become difficult and tricky for us when we're seeking God's will for us in big and small things. But what we see here is that Abraham could narrow down the options to discern where God's will was based on God's principles, based on common reason, common sense. And the next question, number 3, what would happen if the woman God chose didn't choose to come? This is a very interesting one. And the next question with it, what does it say about the relationship between God's will and human will? Going back and going further down in chapter 24, verse 8, if the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. This is interesting. This is the woman that God had chosen. God had chosen this woman to be the wife of Isaac. And yet Abraham is acknowledging that it was possible for that woman herself to not choose to be chosen, not choose to go along with what God's will was. And if that happened, Abraham says, well, we'll just have to keep going and look for another option, which is very significant. It illustrates a point shown elsewhere in the Bible that it is possible for humans to work against the will of God. The other way of saying that point is that God's will is not always done in this planet. Things happen on this planet that are not the will of God, but they are the will of humans, and God has allowed humans to work out according to their will. Another way of looking at this, the fact that Jesus instructs us to pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The fact that he's putting a distinction and saying that it's not always done here on earth as it is in heaven. In heaven, yes, God's will is always done. But here on earth, humans work contrary to the will of God. And there are many times where God allows that, as he would have done if Rebekah had not chosen to go along with his will here. And so what that says for us is that we shouldn't always think that, oh, well, something happened and, everything happens for a reason. And so God is working through this thing. Now, yes, God does work through things that are not good, but it's not that was God's will for that to happen. Someone takes advantage of someone abuses someone exploits someone in some way. When people do these things, this is not God's will. This is not in any way in harmony with the will of God. This is an example of people going outside of the will of God and working in accordance with their will. And God has allowed a measure of freedom in this world for humans to carry out their own will. And so again, that's another point we see illustrated here in this story. The next question is number 5. What sign did Abraham's servant ask for? What was the sign that Abraham's servant asked for? And this is going down verses 13 and 14. I'll just read verse 14. He says, "May it be when I say to a girl, 'Please let down your jar that I may have a drink.' And she says, 'Drink, and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know you have shown kindness to my master.'" And the question related to this is, was the sign arbitrary or related to what he was asking? Arbitrary in the sense that, was the sign, well, the first woman that comes along with a pink headband, that'll be the one that you have chosen. No, it wasn't something arbitrary. It wasn't something irrelated. It was very closely related to the kind of woman Isaac would need. Someone in our study this week used the word hospitable, that the woman that he would need to be a wife would be a hospitable, a courteous, a polite woman, a thoughtful woman. And we see this sign related to that. So again, even in seeking signs, and in this point, they've gone as far as they could go by reasoning based on God's principles, and they've discerned that the woman must be not in Canaan, must be in Abraham's household. But there are women in Abraham's household, and they don't know which one, so they have to rely on some other way of God directing them and revealing to them what his will was. And for this, he seeks a sign. But again, the sign he's seeking is related to what the issue that he is seeking from God. And I want to make that point as well, that that's also something we want to do, is that if we're asking God to help us with a decision, asking for some guidance, that it also will be helpful for us to ask him to guide with giving us wisdom, giving us insight. If we're looking for a new house or looking for a vehicle and making these kind of decisions, it's probably not the best to say, okay, Lord, the first car that I see that has the windows down in the dealer's parking lot, or the first house that I see with the garage open, or these things are just arbitrary signs that sometimes we're tempted to follow. But I think in harmony with what Abraham's servant did here, we ask God to show you a house. If you have children and you need a place you want the children to play in the front or backyard, ask God to guide you to a house that has something related to what you're searching for. Similar with a car, or of course there are many other decisions in life, but it's wise for us, it's probably best for us to look to God to give guidance and insight based on things that are related to the matter at hand, the issue that we're seeking from God. Going to go to question, where are we? 7. In addition to the sign, what confirmation did he receive that Rebekah was the one? And this is a very significant point here. After he has the immediate, it says, while he was still speaking, verse 15 says, before he had finished praying, Rebekah came, and then she fulfills the sign. However, I want to highlight this point, which is very important, and a point that I've often overlooked in my own experience. Verse 21, without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. Now, he receives the sign in an impressive manner. As soon as he's not even finished praying, before he's finished praying, the sign that he's praying for comes to pass. Now, that to me would be evidence that, wow, this is the one. And I've done something like that before. I feel, wow, this is just in harmony with what I was asking from God. This seems very closely related to what I'm seeking from God. But instead of jumping and saying for certain this was it, it says he waited without saying a word. He watched closely to learn, because there were some other restrictions, and he wasn't going to jump ahead, jump the gun is a phrase we would use, and say, well, this is the one without having everything come to pass. There's a level of patience. There's a willingness to wait until God has entirely revealed if this is his will or not. Because the last and most important specification, that the woman had to be of Abraham's house. And so, of course, you know the rest of the story. She was. And so that's the good news, that he was able to see fully that she matched all of the descriptions and that she was indeed in harmony with the will of God that he was seeking. Lastly, in number 8, after he told the story to Rebekah's family, what was their immediate response? And this is, I think, again, very important. Going now to verse 50. Laban, that's the brother, and Bethuel, the father, answered, "This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." I think this is a very important point. In this case, the will of God that they were seeking did not only involve Abraham, Isaac, and Abraham's servant here. It involved a decision and even sacrifice on the part of Rebekah and her family, because of course they'd be losing her and the help that she was providing to them, as we see her working for the family in coming to the well to draw water. So they were going to have to make a move. And not only then do we see confirmation for the servant, confirmation for Abraham, confirmation for Isaac, we see that the way God led was open and plain confirmation for all parties involved. Everyone who was called to make a sacrifice, who was called to make some action in harmony with the will of God in this, they were able to receive confirmation that this was the moving of God. They didn't have to simply trust the servant coming and saying, "I feel that God is leading that Rebekah should come be the servant, that Rebekah should come be the wife of Isaac." No, when he told the story, it was beyond refutation. It was plain. No one could deny that this was of the Lord. And that's the way they said it. This is from the Lord. And then the last part of verse 51, as the Lord has directed. I think this is also very important. When God is guiding us and giving us direction in the way we should go, yes, we ought to seek and look to him for confirmation, especially when it's a big decision, when it's involving great risk, when it's involving great sacrifice. We should look to him for confirmation and understanding. But when these decisions involve others, when they involve risks for others, when they involve sacrifices for others, in those times, I believe the Bible here and elsewhere shows us that those others who are involved also ought to be independently convinced that this is the will of the Lord. Not convinced just because I said so, just because I'm convinced you should be convinced, but the way that God leads, has shown himself to be leading in the Bible, Old and New Testament. He leads in a way that all parties who are called to make a risk, make a sacrifice in harmony with this decision, all parties can be independently convinced that this is from the Lord.